"You've got 48 hours to sell your cabin, or we'll take legal action." I read the line out loud because it didn't sound real until the words left my mouth. The paper shook in my hand, not because I was scared, but because the sentence was so absurd it made my pulse jump. It was a Saturday morning, 7 o'clock sharp, coffee half brewed, and outside the window Denise Benson's mower was roaring like clockwork. She always started at 7. Always. A knock hit the porch. "It's open," I called. Harris Martinez stepped in, cap pulled low, jacket still damp from the morning air. He's an electrician by trade, 2 cabins down, and the kind of neighbor who never wastes a word. He saw my face, then the paper, and frowned. "What's going on?" I slid the letter across the table. "Read it." He scanned the first lines, then whistled. 48 hours? "Colby, this isn't even close to legal." "That's the point," I said. "They're not playing by the rules. They're trying to scare me." Harris shook his head. "This isn't a notice. It's intimidation on cheap paper." The mower droned louder outside, as if Denise knew we were talking about her. She loved control. She loved the noise that reminded everyone who ran this community. I set my coffee down, pulled an old wooden box from the top shelf, and flipped it open. Inside was a folder I hadn't touched in years. I slid out the easement agreement, laid it flat on the table next to the letter. "You remember when they put the power lines through my property?" I asked. Harris nodded. "Yeah, I helped mark the survey stakes. Easement only allowed residential use." I tapped the clause with my finger. Section 12, subsection B. Any for-profit activity requires reclassification. Business rates are triple. Harris leaned closer, eyes narrowing. "You think they've been running something commercial through your lines?" "I don't think." "I know," I said. "Those EV chargers at the marina? I saw tourists swiping credit cards last night." He let out a low whistle. "That changes everything." "It does," I said. "They're making money off a corridor that was never zoned for business. And if they want to push me with bogus notices, I'll push back with actual law." Harris folded his arms. "You want me to bring my meter? We can check loads, verify." "Bring it," I said. "Bring your camera too. We're going to document every inch." The mower cut off suddenly, leaving the cabin in heavy silence. We both looked toward the window. Denise's red pickup sat square in her driveway, her figure moving across the yard with her usual clipboard. Always the clipboard. Always the performance. "You think she's behind this letter?" Harris asked. "I don't think," I said. "I know. Who else benefits from trying to drive me out?" He placed the letter back on the table, careful like it might stain. "You don't look rattled." I laughed once, sharp. "No, I'm awake, wide awake." The truth was, 2 decades in insurance taught me something most people don't know. Paper wins. Shouting fades. Threats stumble. But documents, those hold up. I wasn't about to panic over a fake ultimatum. They wanted a fight, and they'd handed me the rule book. I slid the easement back into the folder and snapped it shut. "Let's go take a walk," I said. "If those chargers are running off my lines, we're not just talking intimidation anymore. We're talking fraud." Harris adjusted his cap and grinned. "Well, if they're running a business, it's about to get very expensive." I opened the door, and the morning air hit us, cool and sharp off the lake. The path toward the marina stretched quiet under the pines. Harris tapped the pocket where he'd tucked the letter. "You sure you're ready for this?" he asked. I looked once more at the empty coffee cup, at the silent mower, and then at the absurd envelope that had started the day. "Ready?" I said. "No. But willing? Absolutely." And with that, we stepped off the porch together toward the truth waiting at the water's edge. By the time Harris and I reached the path, I knew I needed to step back and set the stage, because none of this would make sense without the people who lived here and the roles they liked to play. Our community looked quiet from the outside, cabins tucked along the lake, porches stacked with rocking chairs, wind chimes clinking in the breeze. To someone passing through, it felt like postcard living. But once you'd been here a while, you learned the truth. Peace was fragile, and control was currency. Denise Benson was the one who craved it most. She wasn't elected president of the HOA because people loved her. She won because people were tired of meetings, tired of arguments, tired of details. Denise loved details. She made lists, rules, addendums. She lived for the sound of her own authority. And if you crossed her, you'd find yourself on the wrong side of a fine, a citation, or, in my case, a fraudulent ultimatum. Then there was Trevor Holt, the treasurer, a decent man once, I think, but years of balancing budgets under Denise's thumb had drained him of backbone. Trevor was the kind of person who looked down when voices got loud, who signed checks without asking too many questions. Some called him complicit. I called him cornered. Margaret Patterson lived 3 cabins down from me. Widow, mid-70s, quiet as snowfall until pushed. She had oxygen tanks lined up like soldiers in her living room, and the soft hum of machines kept her steady. Denise never showed mercy for weakness, and that made Margaret a target. I didn't know it yet, but before long, she would be the one who made our neighbors finally stand together. And then there was Harris, steady, sharp-eyed Harris. He'd spent a career running wires through factories and houses, a man who understood current better than conversation. He wasn't flashy, but when Harris spoke, people listened, because Harris never said what he couldn't prove. In a community run by bluster and noise, that mattered. And me? My name's Colby Mercer. 20 years in insurance taught me that paper trails don't lie. I'd sat across from people who lost homes, families, sometimes more, all because they didn't read the fine print. I learned to read every line twice, maybe 3 times. That's why I kept that easement locked away all these years. Not because I thought I'd need it, but because life has a way of testing you when you least expect it. The HOA thought of me as stubborn, independent, hard to push around. They weren't wrong. I didn't buy this cabin to be told how many inches my fence could be, or how straight my lawn edges had to look. I bought it for mornings like this one. The lake still, the air sharp, the smell of pine resin cutting through the fog. Simple, quiet things. But quiet doesn't last when power and money get involved. And that's where Denise had overplayed her hand. She thought this was about a single cabin, about one man she could shove out in 48 hours. What she didn't realize, what she couldn't realize, was that her scheme with the chargers, her greed, her threats, they weren't just cracks in the system. They were dynamite stuffed in the foundation. Harris slowed on the trail, crunch of gravel under his boots. "You think anyone else got a letter?" he asked. "I don't know," I admitted, "but if Denise sent one to me, she's testing the water. If people stay quiet, she'll keep going. If they fight back, well, she doesn't expect that." He nodded slowly. "Then maybe it's time she learned." We walked in silence for a while, the lake glinting between the trees. I thought about the neighbors, about Trevor with his ledger, Margaret with her machines, Harris with his camera, and about Denise with her mower and her clipboard and her hunger to control everything she touched. The pieces were all there. They just hadn't collided yet, but they would, and when they did, there'd be no going back. By the time we reached the edge of the marina path, I stopped walking. Harris turned back, puzzled, but I wasn't looking at him. I was looking at the folder I carried under my arm, the same one that hadn't seen daylight in years. "You ever wonder," I said slowly, "why I keep every scrap of paper they hand me?" Harris shrugged. "Because you don't trust anyone." "Close," I said, "because paper doesn't lie." We cut back toward my cabin. Inside, I cleared the kitchen table, laid out the easement agreement like a dealer setting down his trump card. The old pages smelled faintly of dust and ink, the kind of smell that made me feel safer than I should have. "This," I said, tapping the header, "is the service corridor agreement, 20 years old, signed by the county, the utility company, and me. They run their power under my property. I let them, but only for household use." Harris leaned in, eyes narrowing. "Household only, no exceptions." I slid my finger down the page until it landed on the section I'd nearly memorized. Section 12, subsection B. I read it aloud. "Any for-profit activity conducted through the corridor lines requires immediate reclassification to commercial service and adjusted billing at applicable rates." Harris whistled low. "Reclassification means higher bills." 3 times higher," I said, "sometimes 4. Commercial service isn't cheap. Residential easements are a privilege. The moment they flip to business, the meter flips with them." I sat back in my chair, letting the words hang there. For years, the HOA treated my property like a utility hallway, invisible and taken for granted. But buried in the fine print was the one lever they couldn't afford me pulling. "This is my shield," I told Harris. "If they're taking money at those chargers, they're already violating the agreement. And once it's proven, the state doesn't give them a warning. They send a bill, retroactive." He rubbed his chin. You're telling me if they've been running a public charging station through this corridor, the HOA gets stuck paying commercial rates? Not just stuck, I said. They drown in it. Imagine tripling the electric bill for every common area, marina, clubhouse, street lights, all of it tied back through these lines. Harris chuckled once, a dry sound. That would bankrupt them. Exactly, I said. And Denise knows it. That's why she sent this letter. She wanted me gone before I noticed, before I opened this folder. I thought back to my years in insurance, clients crying at desks because a clause voided their policy, angry contractors shouting when claims were denied. In the end, it always came down to words on paper, not volume, not threats, words, binding words. I lifted the letter again, laid it beside the easement. The difference was laughable. One looked official. The other was official. One barked, the other bit. Harris tapped the bogus notice with his finger. This thing's not worth the ink, but that, he pointed at the easement, that's a hammer. I nodded. And I don't swing hammers lightly. The room went quiet except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. Outside, the mower had gone silent. Maybe Denise was satisfied with her morning theater, or maybe she was already planning the next move. Either way, I had my move now. I stacked the papers neatly, slid them back into the folder, and locked it shut. Tomorrow we'll gather proof, pictures, load readings, payment logs. Once we have it, we send it to the state utility office. Harris grinned. And when they see the evidence, they reclassify, I said, instantly, and the HOA pays every penny they thought they were hiding. I leaned back, exhaling slow. For the first time since reading that ridiculous ultimatum, I felt steady, because Denise might have her mower, her clipboard, her cheap threats, but I had Section 12, subsection B, and that was worth more than all the noise in the world. The path to the marina crunched under our boots, gravel damp from last night's rain. Morning mist hung low across the lake, curling around the dock like smoke. Harris carried his meter bag over one shoulder, his old film camera swinging from the other. "You're sure about this?" he asked. "Positive," I said. "We'll know the truth in 10 minutes." The marina came into view, and so did the chargers. 3 of them, shiny white towers with glowing screens, lined up like soldiers at attention. A blue sign announced in cheerful font, "Public EV charging, credit cards accepted." The words hit me harder than the mower ever could. "Public," I muttered. "There's our smoking gun." Harris pulled his cap lower. "Let's document before anyone shows up." I snapped photo after photo, signs, kiosks, card readers, everything that screamed business. Harris crouched by the timer box mounted on a pole. He flipped it open with practiced ease, exposing digital dials and a humming relay. "Look at this," he said, pointing at the settings. "Switches to public mode at 11 p.m., back to private at 6. They're hiding it during the day." "Automated," I said. They knew exactly what they were doing. Harris clipped his meter leads to the main feed. Numbers flashed on the screen, steady current far above what a few boats and lights could justify. "This is business load," Harris explained for the camera. "Normal homes spike in the evening, then dip. This draw is constant. That means commercial use." I kept the video rolling, zooming on the screen. My pulse kicked harder. This wasn't rumor or suspicion anymore. It was fact, humming through the wires. Just then, a man in a security jacket approached, hand resting near his radio. "Excuse me," he said, voice flat. "This is private property. You can't be here." Harris didn't even look up. "Licensed electrician conducting a safety inspection. State code overrides property restrictions." The guard shifted, unsure. He must have heard conviction in Harris's tone, because after a pause he stepped back. "Just be quick." We were. 20 minutes of photos, readings, notes, every detail locked in. Harris moved to the charging kiosks and tapped a hidden menu. The screen blinked, then revealed a list. "What's that?" I asked. "Transaction history." He scrolled, line after line of card numbers, timestamps, dollar amounts. 2 weeks of business staring us in the face. I pulled out my phone, recording each page. "How many transactions?" "Over 200, Harris said, disbelief in his voice. "All different cards, tourists, commuters, strangers. This isn't a perk for residents. It's a business, pure and simple." He connected his portable printer, the kind electricians carry for reports. The little machine hummed, spitting out pages that stacked like evidence in a courtroom. As the paper rolled, I spotted another sign near the marina entrance. Day passes available. Non-residents welcome. Letters bold enough to catch drivers from the highway. I snapped it. They didn't just cross the line, Harris. They paved a road over it. By the time we packed up, the folder bulged with photos, logs, and readings. The hum of the chargers behind us felt less like convenience and more like a cash register ringing on stolen power. Walking back, Harris broke the silence. Denise is going to fight this. Of course she will, I said, but it doesn't matter. The moment the state sees this, it's out of her hands. He glanced at me. And if the board rallies behind her? I thought about Trevor with his ledger, about Margaret with her machines, about the others who whispered complaints but never stood tall. Then we show them the cost, I said. Paper doesn't argue, bills don't negotiate. Once those charges hit, even Denise can't shout them away. The sun broke through the mist as we reached my cabin, light striking the folder under my arm. Inside, it wasn't just evidence, it was leverage. And leverage, in the right hands, changes everything. Back at the cabin, the folder sat heavy on my kitchen table, papers spread like cards in a poker hand. Evidence, proof, leverage. I barely had time to pour a fresh cup of coffee before the phone rang. Colby, the voice said, low and hesitant. It was Trevor Holt, the HOA treasurer. I heard you got some kind of notice this morning. I let the silence stretch a beat. You mean the illegal one that says I have to sell my cabin in 48 hours? Trevor cleared his throat. Denise handles enforcement. I just manage the books. Enforcement. The word scraped like gravel. So, intimidation is enforcement now? I wouldn't put it that way, Trevor said carefully. Sometimes we have to make strong moves to keep order. Order? I almost laughed. Trevor, tell me, did you know about the EV chargers running at the marina? Another pause. I could almost hear him sweating through the line. Look, I don't really get into operations. That's facilities. Facilities? I snapped. I was just there. Tourists are swiping credit cards at your so-called amenities. That's not facilities. That's commerce. And commerce requires reclassification, which means tripled rates. Which means every penny of your budget just went up in smoke. His voice wavered. Colby, I don't know what you're talking about, but he did. I could feel it. 20 years in insurance trains you to hear truth hiding behind denial. His tone wasn't confusion, it was fear. Listen, Trevor, I said, lowering my voice. I've got load readings, transaction logs, time-stamped photos. Do you realize what happens when the utility company sees those? Reclassification isn't optional, and you, personally, signed off on the budget that hit it. Trevor exhaled hard, almost a groan. I just handle the books. Denise said it was fine. She said it wasn't a big deal. Not a big deal? I leaned forward, gripping the receiver tighter. Insurance calls it misrepresentation. Utility calls it fraud. Courts call it liability. And guess who gets named when coverage is void? No answer. Just breath on the line, ragged, guilty. Trevor, I pressed, you're treasurer. You know where the money goes. You know what those transactions mean. Don't pretend ignorance now. Finally, he spoke, his voice small. What do you want me to do? I want you to admit the truth, I said, that Denise is running this place like her private kingdom, that those letters are harassment, and that you've known the whole time. He hesitated. Too long. I can't. Not yet, he whispered. You don't understand how much pressure she puts on us. I closed my eyes, anger tight in my chest. Trevor, pressure doesn't excuse fraud. When the inspectors come, you can either be the treasurer who covered it up or the one who came clean. That choice is yours. The silence stretched, then a click. He hung up. I set the phone down slowly, staring at the folder. Denise had her mower, her clipboard, her false authority. Trevor had his ledger and his fear, but neither could stand against what I held in black and white. Paper doesn't panic. Paper doesn't lie. I leaned back in my chair, sipping coffee gone cold. They thought they could bluff me out with threats. They thought they could scare the neighbors into silence. But they'd forgotten one thing. Threats are noise. Documentation is power. And I had plenty of it. That night, I couldn't sleep. The bogus sale notice sat on my desk like a dare, and Trevor's shaky voice still rang in my ears. Pressure, he'd said. Pressure from Denise, Pressure from what? The answer came the next morning, tucked inside an envelope Harris slid across my table. "Found this in the trash by the clubhouse," he said. His face was grim. "Thought you might want to look." I pulled out a handful of papers, stapled but stained with coffee. They weren't HOA minutes. They weren't budget notes. These were glossy presentation slides, the kind a developer shows investors. The first page froze me. Maple Ridge Lakeside Redevelopment, Phase 1. I skimmed the bullet points, each one louder than the mower ever was. Acquire distressed cabins within 12 months. Consolidate parcels for marina expansion. Convert clubhouse into private resort amenities. Partnership with Lakeshore Development Group. At the bottom, in neat bold print, projected profit margin, 240%. I looked up at Harris. "They're trying to force people out," he nodded. "Notice the timeline, 12 months. That's why the 48-hour letters. They need quick sales to stay on schedule." I flipped through the pages, my hands trembling. One slide showed our shoreline dotted with red X's, cabins marked target properties. My stomach dropped it when I saw mine, and Margaret's, and Jim's, the retired teacher 2 doors down. "These aren't violations," I whispered. "They're eviction strategies." Harris tapped a line at the bottom of the last page. HOA leadership to facilitate compliance through enforcement measures. Enforcement, I muttered. That's their word for harassment. It all clicked then. The bogus notices, the threats, even the EV chargers. The chargers weren't just revenue, they were leverage, cash flow to fund the takeover. Denise wasn't running a neighborhood. She was running a scheme. "Colby," Harris said quietly, "this isn't just about money anymore. It's about control. She wants to turn neighbors into obstacles, and obstacles get pushed out." I shoved the papers back into the envelope. My chest burned, not with fear, but with something sharper. She picked the wrong obstacle. By noon, I had copies of the documents spread across my table, lined up next to the easement agreement, the charger logs, the fake notice. The picture was clear. Denise's HOA wasn't protecting property values. It was dismantling them. That's when my phone buzzed with a new text. A number I didn't recognize. "Mr. Mercer, you don't understand the position you're in. Accept the notice, take the payout, and walk away." Fighting only makes it worse. No signature, no name, but I didn't need one. The words dripped with Denise's brand of arrogance. I read it twice, then handed the phone to Harris. He shook his head slowly. "She's desperate, and desperate people make mistakes." "She already has," I said. "She left a trail, and I intend to follow it." That evening, I walked to the shoreline with my folder under my arm. Lights glowed in neighbors' cabins, families laughing over dinner, dogs barking at squirrels in the yard. All ordinary, all fragile, all marked with red X's in Denise's plan. It wasn't just my fight anymore. It never had been. When I reached Margaret's porch, she was sitting in her rocking chair, blanket around her shoulders, oxygen machine humming quietly beside her. She smiled when she saw me, then frowned at the envelope in my hand. "Bad news?" she asked. I sat on the step. "Worse than bad. They're not fixing violations. They're clearing space for developers." Her face went pale, then hard. "Over my dead body." I nodded. "That's exactly what I'm afraid of." The machine hissed softly between us, steady and fragile, like the breath of the whole neighborhood. Denise thought she was building a resort, but what she'd built instead was a battlefield. The morning after I found those developer papers, my porch filled with footsteps. First Harris, then Jim, the retired teacher, then a pair of younger couples from farther down the road, and finally Margaret, walking slow with her oxygen machine humming beside her, a neighbor steadying her arm. They didn't wait for me to ask why they'd come. Margaret held up a crumpled envelope, shaking in her hand. "Colby," she said, voice thin but steady, "I got one too. 48 hours to sell, because my fence is 6 inches too high." The paper trembled in her grip, not from weakness, but anger. My chest tightened. "She threatened you?" "Threatened all of us," Jim cut in, pulling his own letter from his jacket pocket. "Mine says my chimney violates code. Never been a problem before." Around the porch, more hands lifted envelopes. 4, 5, 6 in total. Each one the same format, the same arrogant language. Sell or face legal action. The sight chilled me. I wasn't alone in this fight. None of us were. Denise hadn't just targeted me. She'd spread her poison like wildfire. "Neighbors," I said, my voice heavier than I intended. This isn't enforcement. It's harassment. And now we know why. I spread the developer slides across the table, careful so everyone could see. Faces leaned in, eyes narrowing, jaws tightening. Margaret's hand trembled on the page marked with red X's. Her cabin was circled in bold. She planned this, Margaret whispered. Planned to drive us out. Not just you, I said. All of us. Every cabin marked target property belongs to someone who doesn't play by Denise's rules. She wants the land, not the people. The porch went quiet. For the first time, fear wasn't the strongest feeling in the air. It was anger. Shared, steady anger. Jim adjusted his glasses, voice sharp. Colby, I looked up Michigan code last night. Service changes require 30 days notice. These 48-hour ultimatums? Illegal on their face. Harris nodded. And I've got transaction logs proving the Marina Chargers are running as a business. Combined with the easement clause, that's a financial bomb under the HOA's feet. One of the younger men spoke up, his fist clenched. So, what do we do? Just wait until Denise bleeds us dry? No, I said firmly. We document every threat, every false claim, every letter like these. Harris lifted his old film camera, the strap frayed from years of use. We'll take pictures, each of you, holding your letters. Nobody can say you imagined it. Margaret straightened in her chair. And I'll speak to the neighbors who are still afraid. Nobody should suffer alone. The air shifted. Fear gave way to resolve. One by one, residents lifted their envelopes as Harris snapped photo after photo, the honest click of film freezing each face, each paper, each defiant stance. When it was Margaret's turn, she held her letter high despite her trembling hands. The camera flashed, and for a moment her eyes burned brighter than the morning sun. They threatened my electricity, she said after the picture, voice breaking. Told me if I didn't sell, they'd cut my power. I need this machine to breathe. A murmur rippled through the group, shock, then outrage. Jim nearly dropped his glasses. That's not just harassment, that's criminal endangerment. Cutting medical power is against every law we have. I placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder, and we'll make sure every authority hears about it. Harris flipped through the photos, nodding. This is the record, proof no lawyer can dismiss. The porch filled with voices, plans, promises, determination. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down now leaned forward, their words carrying the weight of people who had finally had enough. As the meeting broke, each walked away taller than when they'd arrived. Margaret lingered, her oxygen hiss steady, her hand squeezing mine. Thank you, Colby, she whispered. Not just for me, for all of us. I watched her shuffle down the path, neighbors flanking her like guards. For the first time since this nightmare began, I didn't feel alone. Denise wanted fear. What she'd created was unity, and unity was far stronger than her mower, her clipboard, or her threats. It was just past 2 in the morning when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. Motion detected, utility corridor. I rubbed my eyes, heart already pounding. The security camera feed lit up the screen, grainy but clear enough. A figure crouched at the junction box behind my property. At first, I thought utility worker, but no crew comes without notice. No crew shows up in the dead of night. Then she stood. Even in the dim glow of a flashlight, I recognized the short, sharp silhouette, the posture, the clipped movements. Denise Benson. Dark clothes, wire cutters in her hand. My stomach dropped. She wasn't here to inspect. She was here to sabotage. I called Harris immediately. Harris, get over here. Bring your camera. Denise is at the corridor, cutting into the lines. He was wide awake instantly. You're serious? Dead serious? She's out there right now? I threw on my jacket and crept to the back window. Denise knelt again, tugging at wires, prying at metal with unsteady hands. Sparks flickered, sharp and dangerous in the night. I knew enough about electricity to understand. One wrong cut could mean fire, blackout, or worse. Harris arrived within minutes, camera bag slung over his shoulder. He ducked low beside me. Where? There, I whispered, pointing through the trees. She's been at it 10 minutes. He pulled out his camera, disabled the flash, and started shooting frame after frame. Each click felt like a nail in her coffin. And then it happened. A sudden shriek of alarms tore through the night. Sirens blared. Red strobes pulsed along the corridor. Denise jerked back, eyes wide. Her clumsy tampering had triggered the utility's safety grid. Dogs barked. Windows opened. Porch lights blinked on across the cabins like falling dominoes. The neighborhood was awake. "Colby," Harris whispered, camera still rolling. "She just tripped a grid violation. Response teams are coming." I stepped out onto the porch as headlights barreled down the road. A utility truck screeched to a stop, emergency lights flashing. Two technicians jumped out in reflective gear, tools in hand. "Ma'am," one shouted, beams of their flashlights pinning her in place. "Step away from the electrical equipment. Now!" Denise froze like a deer caught in headlights, wire cutters dangling useless in her grip. Harris and I hurried closer, just as the techs inspected the mess. The lead's fuse darkened. Ground wires cut, voltage lines stripped. This could have started a fire or killed someone. He looked at Denise, disbelief in his voice. "What on earth were you thinking?" Her chin jutted out, stubborn as ever. "I was just checking connections. As HOA president, I have authority over utilities." The technician actually laughed, short, sharp, scornful. "Ma'am, HOA presidents don't control electrical infrastructure. What you did is felony sabotage." By then, more vehicles had arrived. Fire trucks, a sheriff's cruiser, even the utility supervisor. Neighbors gathered in pajamas, some clutching coffee mugs, others recording on their phones. The quiet lakeside night had turned into a crime scene. The deputy sheriff stepped forward, voice carrying over the noise. "Mrs. Benson, you are under arrest for tampering with utility equipment, criminal mischief, and endangering public safety." He read her rights as he cuffed her. The crowd murmured, half shocked, half vindicated. Denise's glare found me through the flashing lights. "This is your fault, Colby. None of this would have happened if you'd just sold." The deputy cut her off. "Ma'am, threatening property owners while in custody won't help your case." A firefighter muttered nearby, "Never seen someone try to black out a whole neighborhood over a grudge." The utility supervisor shook his head, scribbling on a clipboard. "This isn't careless. This is deliberate sabotage. She stripped protective grounding. One surge could have fried every home system here." I handed over my security footage. Harris passed along his photos. The technicians documented every cut, every scorch mark. The evidence was undeniable. By dawn, crews were already repairing the damage. The inspector gave me a copy of the incident report. "Mr. Mercer, this will be valuable if you pursue charges. What she did carries heavy penalties." I nodded, the paper heavy in my hand. When Harris and I finally sat on my deck, the night's adrenaline still buzzing in my veins, he exhaled hard. "Colby, she's gone too far. This isn't a board dispute anymore. This is criminal court territory." He shook his head, almost laughing. "She didn't just cross the line, she pole vaulted over it with wire cutters." I leaned back, watching the sun climb over the lake, casting gold across the water. My community had seen the truth with their own eyes. Denise Benson wasn't just a bully with a mower and a clipboard. She was a criminal willing to gamble with lives. And now, justice had finally caught up to her. The neighborhood was still buzzing from Denise's midnight arrest when another storm rolled in. This time quieter, but far more chilling. It was Wednesday morning. My phone rang before I'd even poured coffee. Margaret's voice cracked through the line, strained and trembling. "Colby." She sent me another notice. I was out the door in seconds, boots crunching down the frosted path toward her cabin. The steady hiss of her oxygen concentrator greeted me before I even stepped inside. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, hands shaking, a sheet of paper clenched tight. She slid it toward me. The words on the page turned my stomach. "Final warning, utility service termination. Medical exemptions do not apply to non-compliant properties." I looked at the machines surrounding her. Oxygen hissing, medication fridge humming, red light blinking on her alert system. Each one depended on power. Each one was her lifeline. "Colby," she whispered, her voice breaking, "if they cut my electricity, I could die." I clenched the paper so hard it crumpled. "They won't. I swear it." But inside my blood boiled. This wasn't harassment anymore. It was cruelty, weaponizing power lines against the most vulnerable. I called the sheriff right there at her table. "This is Colby Mercer. I need to report a direct criminal threat against an elderly neighbor's medical equipment." Detective Morrison took the line. I read the notice aloud, each word burning my throat. His reply was immediate, sharp. "Mr. Mercer, threatening medical devices constitutes criminal endangerment. We'll be issuing a warrant for additional charges." Margaret exhaled shakily, tears welling. "They've gone too far." A knock came at the door. It was Trevor, the treasurer. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days, clothes wrinkled, ledger tucked under his arm. His voice was low, ashamed. "Mrs. Patterson, I owe you an apology." Margaret blinked at him, wary. "An apology?" He nodded, opening the ledger to reveal records. I knew Denise was overstepping, but I didn't know she was targeting medical needs. She's been using HOA funds to pay for private investigators, security guards, even these notices. All intimidation, all of it, paid with your dues. Margaret gasped. "So, we've been funding our own harassment?" His eyes dropped. "Yes, and I signed the checks, thinking it was legal defense. I was wrong." I leaned forward. "Why admit it now?" He gestured toward Margaret's oxygen machine, his voice breaking. "Because threatening someone's lifeline isn't management. It's attempted murder. I won't cover for her anymore." Before we could respond, Harris burst in, camera bag slung over his shoulder. "Colby, Denise posted bail. She's back at the marina, trying to dismantle the chargers with contractors." I swore under my breath. Trevor straightened, a spark of resolve replacing his shame. "I'll stay here with Margaret. No one touches her power." For the first time, his voice carried conviction. Harris and I raced toward the marina. Denise was there, barking orders at 3 contractors. "Cut the lines! Remove the units! I'll pay triple if you finish today." The men hesitated, tools in hand, eyes flicking to the evidence tags still on the machines. One finally spoke. "Ma'am, if this equipment's part of a case, we're not touching it. No paycheck's worth prison." They packed up, shaking their heads. Denise shouted after them, desperation bleeding through her voice. But it was too late. My phone buzzed. A text from Detective Morrison. "Additional charges filed, criminal endangerment, witness intimidation, evidence tampering, warrant issued." Back at Margaret's, we found her calmer, neighbors filtering in with casseroles and reassurances. Trevor sat beside her, flipping his ledger shut with finality. "She went after widows, the elderly. Anyone vulnerable," he said grimly. "I'm resigning, and I'll hand everything over to authorities." Margaret squeezed his hand weakly. For the first time, I saw gratitude in her tired eyes. That evening, the cabin felt alive with quiet solidarity. Jim researched statutes at the table. Harris installed cameras by the porch. Younger neighbors stacked wood and checked on generators. Even children tiptoed in with blankets and board games, their laughter breaking the tension like sunlight through clouds. As we sat together, Margaret whispered, voice steadier now, "Maybe we'll finally be safe." I nodded, knowing this fight had shifted. Because threatening someone's home was one thing, but threatening their very breath, that was a federal crime. And Denise had just crossed a line no one could ever walk back from. Friday morning broke with a low fog rolling off the lake, pale and quiet. For a moment, it almost felt like peace had returned. Then I heard it, the rumble of engines, not one, but many. Headlights pierced the mist. A line of official vehicles crawled down our narrow road, tires crunching gravel in unison. One after another, they stopped in front of the clubhouse and the marina. Curtains twitched in cabins all around. Neighbors whispered at windows like children watching a parade. Except this wasn't floats and candy. It was justice arriving. Out stepped a wave of uniforms and suits. State utility inspectors in hard hats, insurance investigators with briefcases, federal disability rights officials in dark coats, and local law enforcement flanking them all. Leading the charge was Allison Brooks from State Utility Compliance. She carried a thick folder under one arm, a roll of yellow sticky notes in the other. She looked at me, then at the crowd of neighbors forming. "Mr. Mercer," she said, voice steady but tinged with disbelief, "thank you for your reports. We rarely see this level of systematic abuse in one community." Behind her, Harris adjusted his union cap, already unloading his files. Jim clutched a binder full of statutes. Margaret sat on her porch wrapped in a quilt, oxygen machine humming, neighbors standing guard like sentries. The inspectors wasted no time. For 3 relentless hours, they dismantled Denise's empire of lies piece by piece. At the marina, every charging station was opened, wires traced, meters tested, payment logs downloaded. "Commercial usage," one inspector muttered, scribbling furiously. "Retroactive to installation date." At the clubhouse, insurance investigators spread Trevor's ledger across a table. Sarah from Midwest Insurance flipped through pages with surgical precision. Operating under residential coverage while running commerce constitutes deliberate misrepresentation, she said flatly. That voids policy retroactively. Trevor sat beside her, pale but resolute, pointing out checks Denise had forced him to sign. Private investigators, security guards, intimidation campaigns, all paid from HOA funds. Sarah's pen paused. That's not management, that's fraud. Meanwhile, federal officials interviewed Margaret in her cabin. They examined the threat letter against her medical equipment, their expressions grim. One turned to me afterward, jaw tight. Threatening a resident's life-sustaining devices is not only state crime, it qualifies as a federal disability rights violation. I nodded, though my chest felt heavy. Denise thought she was clever, but she'd opened a door she could never close. By noon, the evidence was stacked high. Photographs, transaction logs, inspection reports, insurance statements, witness testimonies, a wall of proof so tall no lawyer could climb it. Detective Morrison arrived last, warrant in hand. His eyes met mine, and I saw the weight of the moment in them. "Colby, we're ready." Inside the clubhouse, Denise sat hunched at the table, a lawyer whispering in her ear. She looked smaller than I'd ever seen her, but the defiance still flickered in her eyes. Morrison read the charges, voice steady and loud enough for every neighbor gathered outside to hear. "Denise Benson, you are under arrest for criminal harassment, insurance fraud, elder endangerment, evidence tampering, and utility sabotage." The federal officials stepped in as she was cuffed, their tone sharper still. "Additionally, you will face federal charges for threatening medical equipment in violation of disability protection statutes." Her lawyer's face went pale. Denise's jaw dropped, for once without words. As she was let out, the community erupted, not in cheers but in a low murmur of vindication. Years of whispered fear were dissolving, replaced by something sturdier, relief. Later that afternoon, Allison returned with the final reclassification documents. She handed me an envelope so thick it could have been a novel. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "effective immediately, your property's corridor is reclassified as commercial service. The HOA will pay triple rates, retroactive to the first day of their operations." I flipped through the pages, scanning the numbers. $23,000. 3 weeks of greed had ballooned into a financial death sentence. Sarah followed with her verdict. "The community's residential policy is canceled, effective back to the start of misrepresentation. Board members are personally liable for any damages during the uninsured period." Trevor closed his eyes, shoulders sagging under the knowledge. But, unlike before, he didn't look afraid, just determined to finally set things right. As the sun dipped low, the officials packed their vehicles and departed, carrying boxes of evidence that sealed Denise's fate. The road was quiet again, but the silence was different now. This wasn't the hush of intimidation, it was the hush of Justice Landing. The next evening, the clubhouse, usually half empty during board meetings, was packed to the rafters. Every chair filled, neighbors lining the walls, some even standing outside with the doors propped open to hear. The air was heavy, not with fear this time, but with anticipation. At the head of the long wooden table sat Trevor, shoulders hunched but eyes steadier than I had ever seen. Denise's chair, still at the center, sat empty. The cuffs and warrants of the day before had seen to that. Trevor cleared his throat, ledger resting closed in front of him. "We all know why we're here," he said, voice low but carrying. "Our association can't function under lies, intimidation, or fraud. Tonight the board will vote." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Papers rustled. Neighbors shifted in their seats. Jim, the retired teacher, raised a hand. "Before you vote, the residents should speak." Trevor nodded. "Then let's hear them." One by one, voices rose. Margaret, wrapped in a shawl, her oxygen concentrator humming beside her, stood with trembling determination. "Denise threatened my life," she said, her voice steady despite her frail frame. "Not just my property, my breath. If she stays, I won't." The room went still. Then applause broke out, not raucous, but steady, respectful, affirming. Others followed. A young father spoke of his children's safety. A widow recounted late-night knocks on her door. Even Harris, usually calm, lifted his camera bag high. "I've documented every violation," he said firmly. "But no photo can capture the fear she's caused. Enough is enough." Trevor bowed his head. "Thank you." He glanced at the other board members, faces pale, eyes lowered. The motion is simple. Remove Denise Benson from all positions, bar her from future service, and turn over full records to authorities. The vote was swift, unanimous, not a single hand raised in her defense. But the real weight came after. As the decision was recorded, neighbors exhaled as if shedding years of dread. Some muttered under their breath, some wept quietly, and some tore up the notices they had received, shredding the paper like old ghosts no longer able to haunt. When the formalities ended, Sarah from Midwest Insurance stepped forward with a folder. The investigation is complete. The HOA's residential policy is canceled, retroactive to the first day of misrepresentation. Board members bear personal liability for damages. Gasps filled the room. One board member's hands shook visibly. Another pressed a hand to his forehead, whispering, "God help us." Sarah's tone was crisp, businesslike, but final. Fraud doesn't dissolve in sympathy. This association is uninsured until new coverage is lawfully secured. Trevor absorbed the blow, then nodded grimly. "We'll cooperate fully. And I'll be resigning after tonight. I should have stopped this sooner." For the first time, I saw no fear in his eyes, only remorse. Neighbors began to stir, conversations breaking out in clusters. Some worried about dues, others about back payments. But woven through the concern was something stronger, a shared determination that the HOA, if it survived at all, would never again be ruled by fear. Margaret raised her voice one last time. No resident should ever face threats to their medical lifelines because of power-hungry neighbors. Let tonight mark the end of that. The room erupted in applause, longer, louder, unrestrained. I sat back, letting the sound wash over me. For months, Denise had twisted the HOA into a weapon. Tonight, that weapon was broken. When the meeting ended, neighbors lingered outside under the lamplight. They didn't scatter as before. They stood together, trading stories, shaking hands, promising to watch out for one another. The fear that had once hung over every porch now lifted, replaced by something that felt almost unfamiliar: community. As I walked home, Harris clapped me on the shoulder. "Colby," he said with a half smile, "I think we just buried the old HOA." I glanced back at the clubhouse, lights glowing through the fog. "No," I said. "We didn't bury it. We reclaimed it." The morning after the vote, the air felt different, cleaner, lighter. For the first time in weeks, I woke without dread pressing down on my chest. I stepped outside with my coffee, the lake reflecting gold in the early light. Neighbors were already stirring, some waving, some calling greetings across the water. The silence that followed wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was the peace of knowing the bully's grip had been broken. Then came the final piece of the puzzle. A courier truck pulled up to my cabin just before noon. The driver handed me a thick envelope stamped with the seal of the utility company. My hands tightened around it. I already knew what it was. Inside, pages upon pages of calculations, official stamps, and one final notice. Effective immediately, the utility corridor beneath your property is reclassified as commercial service. All community facilities connected to this line will be billed at commercial rates, retroactive to the date operations began. I flipped to the summary sheet. The number at the bottom made me laugh out loud. 23,000. 3 weeks of greed had exploded into a debt large enough to sink the entire association. And the best part? My own cabin remained on residential rates. The board's arrogance had tripled their costs, not mine. I tucked the reclassification notice into a folder and walked down to the community bulletin board by the marina. There, still pinned in the corner, was the first paper Denise had slid under my door. Notice: 48 hours to sell your cabin or face legal action. I pulled it free, smoothed the wrinkles, and pinned the new utility order right beside it. 2 papers, one a bluff, a threat, a piece of paper meant to break me. The other, a hammer of law, a reminder that truth and documentation outweigh fear every time. Neighbors gathered, reading both. Whispers rose, then chuckles, then full-bodied laughter. "She tried to sell you out," one man said, "and now she sold herself out instead." Margaret, leaning on her walker, stared at the papers with tears in her eyes. "We were supposed to lose everything," she said softly, "but instead, justice turned it all around." I nodded. Denise gave me 48 hours. Turns out, that was just enough time to expose every violation she tried to hide. That afternoon, the insurance company followed up. Sarah called with finality in her voice. "Mr. Mercer, the HOA's residential policy is canceled permanently. Every board member who signed under misrepresentation is personally liable. This isn't just fines, it's bankruptcy waiting to happen. By evening, news spread like wildfire. Contractors pulled bids, vendors withdrew contracts. Even the bank flagged the HOA's accounts for review. What Denise had built on intimidation now crumbled under the weight of her own lies. As dusk fell, the community gathered at my cabin. Harris brought his camera, Margaret her quilt, Jim his statute binder, and Trevor, no longer treasurer, just neighbor, carried nothing but a pot of coffee. We sat on the deck, watching the last orange glow fade across the lake. The air buzzed with relief, even laughter. "Colby," Harris said, raising his mug, "you turned their threat into their downfall. They wanted you gone. Instead, you tripled their rent." The group chuckled, heads nodding, the sound warm and real. I held up the original notice one last time. They told me to sell in 48 hours, but instead, they sold themselves out in less than 3 weeks. That's justice, with interest. Margaret reached over, her frail hand squeezing mine. "Thank you for protecting us, not just with papers and photos, but with courage." I swallowed hard, words sticking in my throat. We all did this together. That's what broke their power, not me, us. The night deepened, fireflies sparking along the shore. For the first time in months, I let myself breathe, truly breathe. I thought of Denise sitting in some holding cell, her empire in ruins, her threats meaningless scraps of paper. And I thought of the neighbors beside me, once fractured by fear, now bound by solidarity. The HOA tried to turn our homes into bargaining chips. Instead, we'd turn their scheme into rubble, and all it took was reading the fine print.